Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to On the Middle East. My name is Amrin Zaman, and today I'll be discussing Iraq's parliamentary elections that are set to take place on November 11th. Early voting has already started, and the broad consensus is that the ruling coalition of Shia parties under the Shia coordination framework will retain power. In a brilliant and grim briefing, Renad Mansour, who is a senior fellow for the Middle East and North Africa programme for the UK think tank Chatham House, describes how money and patronage networks dictate outcomes. So what are the stakes for Iran, which has had outsized influence over its Shia majority neighbour since the fall of Saddam Hussein? Renad explains. Welcome to our program, Renad. It's great to have you with us here today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, another election in Iraq, and you wrote this really brilliant and very depressing, actually, essay for Chatham House, unpacking the dynamics and basically explaining how what's being fought over is spoils, power, that sort of thing, with very little regard, really, for the people of Iraq. So, what we're interested in learning from you today is what Iran's role is in all of this, because Iran has had an outsized role in Iraq for all these years. But then, of course, Iraq took quite a big hit in recent months, particularly after this war with Israel. So tell us if that's had any impact on Iran's continuing influence in Iraq and over these elections in particular.
It certainly has. Iran has been facing a big crisis, certainly for the last few years in the region since October 7th. And this has, in one way, hardened its approach to Iraq because Iraq has become even more vital for Iran as it sort of loses or has other allies in the region weakened. Iraq is a very different story. Iraq is on Iran's border. So it's geographically very important and strategic as a buffer. Also, as sanctions continue to cripple Iran's economy, Iraq is an important lifeline economically for Iran, access to, financial markets. And so Iran needs Iraq to work in a certain way for it to begin its adaptation and to survive this transformation that's happening in the Middle East. And for that, of course, Iran is deeply invested and watching what happens in Iraq. But what we have seen recently is that Iran wants Iraq for now to stay stable and to stay out of the regional conflict. So, for example, the Israel-Iran war in June, the 14-day war, both the Iraqi sides and the Iranian sides were on the same page in saying we need restraint. We should not have attacks from Iraq. So Iraq has managed to stay insulated from the wider conflicts in the region. And this has for now suited both Iraq, but also has suited Iran's ambitions in Iraq.
But you now have a new US envoy for Iraq who has his roots in Iraq, who seems to be already very clear in his message about the PMF in particular, the Shiite militias, and the need to disband, disarm them. How do you think going forward and once these elections are behind us, that any new Iraqi government would set about tackling that issue because President Trump is quite different from his predecessors. He seems to match his actions, or rather his words, with action.
And by the way, this has definitely been felt by various leaders of the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces. First of all, it was Trump who killed, through an airstrike, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was the de facto leader of the PMF, along with Qasem Soleimani.
Exactly.
And so there is certainly anxiety by many of these groups, especially in the current context, because many of them are now part of the Iraqi state. They're reaping the benefits of the state, and for them, stability is good for business and resistance is bad for business. So they've gone through this transformation as they gain more influence in the Iraqi state, where they're worried and anxious of any sort of tensions or anything that could derail their continued presence in the state. At the same time, it's become very clear through the new U.S. representative, but even before, from several phone calls from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that the U.S. might not have a coherent policy in Iraq, but the PMF is very much on the U.S. radar. And this is seen as an important policy from the Trump administration. And so there was a PMF law that the Iraqi parliament was trying to pass, and the US basically put its foot down and said, you cannot pass this. And the Iraqi parliament, including the PMF, said, okay, let's leave this aside. So there is a sort of indirect negotiation going on in a way. The PMF line, but also the Iraqi government's line to the US has been the Trump administration wants business. Where else can you have business? Iraq is prime, is ripe for business. You've had Exxon, Chevron, Halliburton, very big US companies come back to Iraq now. So, the Iraqi government, including the PMF, are hoping that the sort of economic card can trump the sort of neoconservative anti-Iran card. But certainly there is a big concern that Mark Zavaya, the Trump's envoy, and others will continue to push against PMF and Iranian influence in Iraq. And the concern, I mean, is from the PMF.
Would it be fair to presume that his appointment, in fact, was intended to signal the Trump administration's determination on this issue, on the PMF issue? Because
Yeah, I
we
mean,
we
sorry.
haven't really had an Iraq envoy, have we?
Yeah, and in fact, Iraq has been off the radar
Totally.
for the Trump administration. You've had, I mean, in my conversations with the Trump administration, it's when it comes to the Middle East, it's been Israel, Iran, even Lebanon and Syria, have envoys and have had attention, but Iraq hasn't. I think with this envoy, it's someone who is very close to President Trump. There's a friendship there. Golf seems to be a way where
And
they
that's
come
a
together.
pattern, right? Because we have the same with Witkoff
Exactly.
and with Barak.
Exactly. So a friend of Iraq who also happens to be Iraqi, sorry, a friend of Trump's who also happens to be Iraqi, and who has a kind of vested interest in working on Iraq. He's a businessman who ran all sorts of businesses in Michigan, and is now seeing an opportunity to work in diplomacy. And for Trump, of course, they're friends. He would give him this position. He served some role already in the Trump administration's policies in Iraq. For example, the freeing of the Israeli PhD student Elizabeth Zirkov.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think to some extent, this is Trump. This is someone putting Iraq on the radar of the Trump administration, for better or for worse. But certainly, the consistent policy from the Trump administration there's been a consistency with the PMF, and there's been a consistency with Iran. But internally, the more neoconservative factions, people, like Joel Rayburn, for example, and others who were seeking to have more prominence there, are often being maneuvered by these friends of Trump with very little experience in the region, and oftentimes with personal vested interests in this.
And in a funny kind of way, I think it leaves Israel sometimes on the offside. We've seen that already play out to some extent in Syria. So in certain ways, maybe the Iraqis should be very grateful for this attention because it could act as a potential buffer against Israeli plans to, let's say, take military action against the PMF, which is something that we know is sitting there on the shelf, right? And that could be pulled off the shelf at any time.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
It's very interesting. Since Zavaya was named the envoy, we've seen quite a bit of attention also shifting to the KRG. How do the Kurds fit into this piece, you think, of this envoy being named, but additionally the whole election?
Just before that, I do want to reiterate the point you made, which is important, really important that um, these Iraqi groups, the PMF and others, are, conflict has been bad for their business. They're part of the state, and they very much view the U.S. relationship as pivotal to avoiding any Israeli escalation. I mean, whenever Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu speaks at the UN General Assembly and he shows his maps, he still has Iraq on his radar.
True.
And they see this and they know that Iraq is still in the firing line. It's one of the only countries that hasn't been as hit as the others. And they believe that because Iraq has this relationship with the US, because there are these other factors there, you have a NATO mission in Baghdad and else, other missions, that it somehow has managed to, while being on the radar, stay insulated. So that relationship with the US is even more important. And that's why you don't actually hear calls either for resistance or even for U.S. troop withdrawal. The U.S. Operation Inherent Resolve ended in September, but where was the noise? Right? So I think that's a very important fact.
Well, a follow-on question then, Renat, is can we then expect any new government in Baghdad to sort of forge closer ties with Shara in that case? Because that's certainly looking at the situation today, Shara's in the White House, right? Uh, Something the United States would certainly want to see.
Certainly, and the Iraqi government has very clearly made its pitch to Shara, and there has been diplomatic initiatives led by the head of intelligence, Hamida Shatri, and others from the Iraqi side. Look, Iraq is in and most countries, but in this case, Iraq is in a region that is so violent right now that's transforming, and the name of the game is survival, and this survival requires a certain pragmatism. That's not to say that they don't have ideological issues either with Trump or even with Shara, who they all view to be a terrorist who was fighting them a few years ago. But they need to set that aside, and there is a kind of pragmatism that is underlining a sort of need to survive in a very uncertain region. For so certainly, but to come back to, I think the question you asked about the Kurdistan region is very important because. Um, the Kurdistan region and particularly the two parties have had very strong relations with the Trump administration and have been lobbying effectively in Washington, much better than the Iraqi federal government actually in terms of its diplomatic outreach. And this has given them a good position in a way, at least in Washington. So while the federal government of Iraq is the sovereign state and will play international relations in that way, the Kurdistan region, has these personal relationships, have these long-term relationships. When it comes to the envoy Mark Zavaya, he has strong relations with the Kurdistan region. He's starting to develop some relationships with the other Iraqis, but that kind of for his, the longer term outlook has shown that he is close to the Kurdistan region's leadership. So that relationship is important for Erbil.
Final question. Turkey has felt that it can benefit from the sort of burgeoning vacuum, at least that's what was the hope, left by Iran's, current plight. It's obviously taken up, very much seized with its own internal problems after everything that happened with Israel. Do you see Turkey playing a bigger role in Iraq generally and in this election through the Sunnis? Because it's always wanted to do that, but never quite succeeded.
Yeah, I think there's been a few interesting developments with Iraq-Turkey relations in the last few years that may have pushed Turkey to not only see Iraq through the Sunni lens in a similar way with the Gulf. Baghdad has reached out. Initiatives such as a development road, which is a project that would connect the Gulf all the way to Turkey through Iraq and other sorts of initiatives around the PKK issue, where the Iraqi government and the Turkish government have worked together on, have established relationships with Baghdad and Ankara. So I think that relationship has developed to some extent. The Sunni, I think in the last election, Iraqi Sunni parties were more united, and Turkey actually had successfully or helped facilitate that unity. The Sunnis in this election are far more divided, so it's a much more difficult landscape for Turkey to navigate. So I wouldn't say that Turkey's influence, which of course Turkey sees it wants to have a lot of influence in Iraq for a number of security and economic and other issues. But at this point, I think Turkey is looking for a more multi-aligned influence, with the Kurdistan region, with Sunnis, and also with the federal government in
They
Baghdad.
managed to stage this reconciliation with Wafd Talabani at the last minute. And
Yes,
Suleimania Airport is now
exactly.
open to Turkish flights, which is great for some of us.
Yeah,
Um, Thank you,
exactly.
Renat, so much for joining us here today. And good luck with the election, I guess.
Thank you so much. It's been great to chat with you, Amran.
And this brings us to the end of another episode of On the Middle East. Thank you for joining us today. And for more in-depth analysis on the Middle East, and God knows there's lots going on, go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Goodbye.